Most people know the names Hitler, Himmler, and Stalin, but the men who actually carried out the killing, the generals who signed the orders, led the columns, and built the camps, have largely faded from public memory. This series covers 10 of them: German, Japanese, and Italian. Some were executed, some escaped justice entirely. One got elected to parliament. One shot himself in a forest rather than face a courtroom. One died peacefully in Rome at 80 years old while the survivors of his concentration camps received no compensation and no acknowledgement from the state that protected him. Every name on this list is backed by trial records, verified historical documentation, and in most cases, the verdicts of international military tribunals. Nothing here is speculation. The facts are enough. What these 10 men did, how they did it, and what happened to them afterward is a record that deserves to be read in full. Because the distance between institutional authority and mass murder in every case on this list turned out to be nothing more than a signature. Hideki Tojo. The general who launched a world war, Hideki Tojo, was born on December 30th, 1884 in Tokyo, Japan. His father, Hidenori Tojo, was a lieutenant general in the Imperial Japanese Army. Growing up in a military household meant one thing above all else: discipline was not optional. It was the air you breathed. Tojo entered the Army Cadet School in Tokyo and graduated in 1905. He then enrolled in the Army War College and emerged as a staff officer. He was not a charismatic leader. He was not loved by his men the way some generals are. What he was organized, methodical, and completely devoted to the idea that Japan was destined for greatness, and that the military was the vehicle to get there. He served as a military attaché in Germany in the 1920s, which exposed him to European military doctrine and hardened his belief in strong centralized authority. When he returned to Japan, he rose steadily through the ranks, earning a reputation as a man who got things done without complaint and without sentiment. By the 1930s, Japan was changing rapidly. The military had begun to dominate the government. Political assassinations of civilian leaders became common. Army factions competed for control of national policy. Tojo aligned himself with the Tosei Ha, the control faction, which believed Japan needed total national mobilization, military, economic, and social, before going to war with the major powers. In 1937, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, the Japanese-occupied territory in northeastern China. That same year, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Tojo pushed operations aggressively. The war in China would become one of the bloodiest conflicts of the entire 20th century, with Chinese civilian deaths numbering in the millions. By 1938, he was back in Tokyo, appointed Vice Minister of War. 2 years later, he became Minister of War. He was now one of the most powerful men in Japan, and the decision that would define his legacy was approaching fast. By 1941, Japan had been at war in China for 4 years with no end in sight. The country was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. Japan had almost no domestic oil. Rubber, iron, tin, all of it had to come from somewhere else. The answer to the military leadership was obvious. Take it by force from the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, most of which were controlled by European colonial powers weakened by the war in Europe. The problem was the United States. America had placed trade embargoes on Japan, cutting off oil exports in response to Japanese aggression in China and Southeast Asia. Without American oil, Japan's military machine would grind to a halt within 2 years. On October 18, 1941, Tojo became Prime Minister of Japan. He also retained his position as Minister of War, giving him control over both the civilian government and the military simultaneously. No one in Japan now held more power. The decision facing his government was stark. Either Japan backed down, withdrew from China, abandoned its territorial ambitions, accepted American demands, or it went to war with the United States and seized the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force. Tojo did not believe backing down was an option. He believed retreat would destroy the military's credibility and Japan's standing in Asia permanently. In November 1941, he personally approved the final plan for a simultaneous attack on American forces at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and British forces across Southeast Asia. The attack was designed to knock out American naval power in the Pacific long enough for Japan to seize a defensive perimeter of islands and resource territories so vast and so fortified that America would eventually accept a negotiated peace rather than fight to retake it all. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. 8 American battleships were damaged or sunk. Over 400 Americans were killed. The United States declared war on Japan the following day. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States 4 days later. What had been a European war and a separate Asian war became a single global conflict. The war Tojo launched was not fought according to the rules that governed warfare between Western powers. The Imperial Japanese Army operated under a code that treated surrender as the ultimate disgrace. This was not simply cultural attitude. It had direct, murderous consequences for everyone unfortunate enough to fall into Japanese hands. In China, where the war had been running since 1937, Japanese forces continued to kill civilians in vast numbers. Conservative estimates by historian R.J. Rummel place total Chinese deaths from Japanese military action at approximately 3 million. Villages were burned. Civilians were used as targets for bayonet practice. Biological weapons were tested on prisoners by Unit 731, a covert military unit operating in Manchuria that conducted lethal experiments on Chinese, Soviet, Korean, and Allied prisoners. Subjects were infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. They were dissected alive. Tojo was aware of Unit 731's existence and its activities. In the Philippines, after the fall of Bataan in April 1942, approximately 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were forced to march roughly 65 miles to a prison camp. They were given almost no food or water. Those who fell were beaten, bayoneted, or shot where they lay. Thousands died during the march itself. Tens of thousands more died in the camps that followed from starvation, disease, and deliberate neglect. Across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, Allied prisoners of war were systematically starved and worked to death in labor camps. The construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway killed an estimated 90,000 Asian laborers and over 12,000 Allied prisoners of war through forced labor, starvation, disease, and violence. The railway was built under Japanese military direction, within the command structure Tojo headed. Women across Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and other occupied territories were forced into sexual slavery to serve as Japanese soldiers in what became known as the Comfort Women System. Estimates of the total number of women subjected to this system range from tens of thousands to over 200,000. It was not a spontaneous byproduct of war. It was an organized military institution that operated throughout Japanese-occupied Asia under the authority of the same military Tojo commanded. By 1943, the war was turning. The American industrial machine had mobilized completely. Japan could not replace its losses in ships, aircraft, or experienced pilots fast enough. Island by island, the Americans pushed back across the Pacific. Tojo responded by concentrating more power in his own hands. In 1943, he took over as Minister of Commerce and Industry. In February 1944, he added Chief of the Army General Staff to his existing roles. One man was simultaneously Prime Minister, Minister of War, and Chief of the Army General Staff. It was unprecedented even by Japanese wartime standards. It did not work. In June 1944, American forces captured Saipan in the Mariana Island chain. Saipan was close enough to the Japanese home islands that American bombers based there could reach Tokyo. Its loss made the ultimate defeat of Japan visible to anyone willing to look at the situation honestly. On July 18, 1944, Tojo resigned as Prime Minister. He had held power for 2 years and 9 months. During that time, Japan had attacked the United States, overrun much of Asia and the Pacific, and overseen atrocities against millions of people across a territory larger than the entire European continent. Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945. 1 week later, General Douglas MacArthur ordered the arrest of the first 40 suspected war criminals. Hideki Tojo was on that list. On September 11, 1945, American military police surrounded Tojo's house in Tokyo. They heard a muffled shot from inside. Tojo had shot himself in the chest, pressing the gun against a charcoal mark he had drawn on his skin to locate his heart. The bullet missed. He was found bleeding heavily, still alive. American doctors treated his wounds. The man who had launched a world war and overseen the deaths of millions was kept alive so he could face justice. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, convened on May 3, 1946. 28 defendants were charged. Tojo was the most prominent. He faced 55 separate counts covering crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. At trial, Tojo accepted responsibility. He stated, "It is natural that I should bear entire responsibility for the war in general, and, needless to say, I am prepared to do so." He was found guilty of waging wars of aggression in violation of international law and of ordering the inhumane treatment of prisoners of war and civilians. On November 12, 1948, the death sentence was handed down. On December 23, 1948, Hideki Tojo was hanged at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. He was 63 years old. The American military took extraordinary precautions with his remains. His body was cremated and his ashes were scattered from a U.S. Army aircraft over the Pacific Ocean approximately 30 miles east of Yokohama. A U.S. Army major personally certified that he had received the remains, supervised the cremation, and scattered the ashes himself. The location was classified for decades. There would be no grave. There would be no shrine. In 1978, Tojo and 12 other convicted war criminals were secretly enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, a Shinto memorial honoring Japan's war dead. This decision ignited a diplomatic controversy between Japan, China, and South Korea that has never been fully resolved. Chinese and South Korean officials have repeatedly refused to meet with Japanese prime ministers who visit the shrine to pay respects. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The man who stood trial alongside Tojo for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of civilians in Nanjing was General Iwane Matsui, a commander who received daily reports of mass killing as it happened and did nothing to stop it. What his troops did inside one Chinese city over 6 weeks, and how his own words at a memorial service sealed his fate at the gallows, is what comes next. Iwane Matsui, the general who unleashed the rape of Nanjing. Iwane Matsui was born in Nagoya, Japan, on July 27, 1878. His father was an impoverished samurai, a former retainer to a feudal lord whose world had been dismantled by Japan's rapid modernization in the decades following the Meiji Restoration. Growing up in that household meant absorbing a specific set of values: loyalty, discipline, hierarchy, and an almost religious reverence for military service. Matsui chose the army. He graduated from the Army War College in 1906 and immediately volunteered for an overseas posting. Over the following decades, he rose through the ranks steadily, earning a reputation inside the Imperial Japanese Army as the institution's foremost expert on China. He spoke Chinese. He had spent years in the country. He understood its politics, its factions, and its people in a way that most Japanese officers did not. He was also a passionate believer in Pan-Asianism, the ideology that held that Asian nations should unite under Japanese leadership to drive out Western colonial powers and build a new order across the continent. He helped found the Greater Asia Association, an influential organization that promoted this vision. In his own mind, Matsui was not an enemy of China. He genuinely believed Japan and China were brothers, and that Japanese military power would ultimately liberate Asia rather than subjugate it. He retired from active duty in 1935. He was 57 years old and had spent his entire adult life in the Army. The retirement did not last long. In August 1937, As the Second Sino-Japanese War exploded into full-scale conflict following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July, Matsui was pulled back from retirement and given command of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force. Japan needed experienced commanders who understood China. Matsui fit that description better than almost anyone. The Battle of Shanghai lasted 3 months. It was brutal and costly for both sides. The Chinese Nationalist Army, better equipped and more tenacious than the Japanese had expected, inflicted enormous casualties. When Japanese forces finally broke through in November 1937, Matsui pushed his commanders to pursue the retreating Chinese forces toward their capital city, Nanjing. The High Command in Tokyo agreed. The march toward Nanjing began. As Japanese forces advanced toward the city, the atrocities started before they even arrived. Entire villages along the route were burned. Civilians were killed. Soldiers competed in what Japanese newspapers at the time reported with enthusiasm as killing contests. Officers racing to see who could behead 100 people first using a sword. These contests were covered by Japanese journalists as sporting events. The reports ran in the Tokyo newspapers. On December 1st, 1937, the Chinese government abandoned Nanjing. Chiang Kai-shek ordered the removal of nearly all official Chinese military forces, leaving the city defended by a small rearguard of mostly untrained auxiliary troops and roughly 200,000 to 300,000 civilians who had nowhere to go. An international safety zone was established by a group of foreign nationals, Germans, Americans, and others, who chose to stay behind and attempt to protect civilians. On December 13, 1937, Japanese troops entered Nanjing. What followed over the next 6 weeks is one of the most extensively documented atrocities in modern history. Chinese men of military age were rounded up in their thousands on the grounds that they might be soldiers who had discarded their uniforms. They were marched to the outskirts of the city in large groups, bound with their hands behind their backs, and executed by machine gun fire and bayonet. Their bodies were thrown into the Yangtze River or buried in mass graves. The killing did not stop at military-age men. Elderly men, women, and children were killed in their homes, on the streets, and in the supposed safety of the International Safety Zone itself. Japanese soldiers entered the zone repeatedly despite its protected status. John Robb, a German businessman and Nazi Party member who led the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, documented the violations daily in letters and diary entries that survived the war. He wrote to Matsui directly, pleading for the killing to stop. The killing continued. The sexual violence was systematic and industrial in scale. Women of every age were targeted. Estimates of the number of rapes committed during the Nanjing massacre range from 20,000 to 80,000. Many victims were killed afterward. The American embassy, the German embassy, and foreign journalists still in the city all documented what was happening in real time and reported it to their governments. The total death toll from the Nanjing massacre is disputed and has been disputed for decades, primarily by Japanese nationalist politicians and historians who have sought to minimize or deny it entirely. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East established a minimum figure of 200,000 civilian deaths. Chinese government estimates place the figure at 300,000. No serious historian of the period disputes that a massacre of enormous scale occurred. Matsui himself entered Nanjing on December 17, 1937, 4 days after the killing began. What he saw disturbed him deeply. He later described weeping in front of his assembled officers. He told them that what had occurred was a disgrace to the Imperial Army, that the honor they had built through the conquest of Shanghai had been destroyed in a single moment. His officers, according to his own account, laughed at him. His response to what he witnessed was to call a meeting and express dismay. He did not arrest the officers responsible. He did not convene courts-martial. He did not order the withdrawal of troops from the city to stop the violence. He issued verbal instructions to tighten discipline and then proceeded with his triumphal entry into Nanjing as planned. The killing continued for weeks after Matsui entered the city. In January 1938, Matsui was removed from his command. The reasons were multiple. Reports of the atrocities had reached Tokyo and caused international embarrassment. The foreign ministry was angry about anti-Western statements he had made. His relationships with his subordinate commanders had broken down badly. Some within the Army General Staff had wanted him court-martialed for negligence, though that never happened. He retired from the Army in 1938 and returned to private life. He spent the war years involved with Pan-Asian cultural organizations, giving speeches, and maintaining his belief that what Japan was doing in Asia was ultimately a project of liberation. He built a small Buddhist shrine at his home, which he called Koain, the Institute for the Development of Asia, where he prayed for both Japanese and Chinese soldiers killed in the war. Japan surrendered in August 1945. The American occupation authorities moved quickly to identify and arrest those responsible for war crimes. Matsui was arrested and charged before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. He faced trial in Tokyo alongside Tojo and 26 other defendants. The prosecution's case against Matsui rested on a simple and devastating argument. He was the commanding general. He entered the city on December 17th. He received daily reports from Japanese diplomatic representatives in Nanjing documenting the atrocities as they happened. He held a position of command authority that gave him the power to stop the killing. He did not stop it. His defense was that he had issued orders in advance of the capture of Nanjing, instructing his troops to respect civilians and treat the city with discipline. He argued that when he entered the city and discovered what had occurred, he was horrified and gave immediate instructions for it to stop. He argued that the worst of the killing was already over by the time he arrived. The tribunal did not accept this as sufficient. The evidence showed that the killing continued for weeks after his entry into the city. The evidence showed he had received reports of what was happening from multiple sources. The evidence showed his response had been inadequate. His own words at a memorial service for Chinese soldiers killed in the campaign, delivered in February 1938, were read into the record. He had said at that service, "The Nanjing incident was a terrible disgrace. Immediately after the memorial services, I assembled the higher officers and wept tears of anger before them. I told them that after all our efforts to enhance the imperial prestige, everything had been lost in one moment through the brutalities of the soldiers. And can you imagine it? Even after that, these officers laughed at me." The tribunal found that his knowledge of the atrocities, combined with his failure to take adequate action to stop them, made him criminally responsible. He was convicted of war crimes under count 55 of the indictment, deliberately and recklessly disregarding his duty to take adequate steps to prevent atrocities committed by troops under his command. On November 12, 1948, Iwane Matsui was sentenced to death. He was the only defendant at the Tokyo trials convicted solely on war crimes charges rather than crimes against peace, meaning the tribunal held him accountable specifically for what his troops did in Nanjing, not for the broader decision to wage aggressive war. On December 23, 1948, Matsui was hanged at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. He was 70 years old. He was executed on the same morning as Tojo and 5 others. His ashes, like theirs, were scattered over the Pacific Ocean by American military personnel to prevent any nationalist commemoration. In 1978, he was among the 14 convicted war criminals secretly enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine, a decision that remains one of the most diplomatically sensitive acts in the entire post-war history of Japan-China relations. The Chinese government has made clear, repeatedly and consistently, that visits by Japanese officials to that shrine constitute an endorsement of the men enshrined within it. The city of Nanjing today contains the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, built near one of the mass grave sites. UNESCO added the memorial hall's historical documents to its Memory of the World Register. Every December 13th, the anniversary of the day Japanese troops entered the city, China holds a national memorial ceremony. In Japan, the debate over what happened in Nanjing has never fully closed. Nationalist politicians have periodically claimed that the death toll was exaggerated or that no massacre occurred at all. Mainstream Japanese historians and the Japanese government have acknowledged that serious crimes were committed, while disputes over the precise scale continue. The gap between how China remembers December 1937 and how portions of Japan's political class preferred to discuss it, remains one of the most significant unresolved historical frictions in East Asia. Matsui's own diary entries, his letters to subordinates, his speech at the February 1938 memorial service, and his testimony at the Tokyo trials form a record that is difficult to interpret charitably. He knew what was happening. He said so himself. What he did in response was not enough to stop it, and at the Tokyo trials, that was enough to send him to the gallows. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next general on this list signed his name to orders that made murder official German military policy. Not in the chaos of a captured city, but in cold, bureaucratic ink from an office in Berlin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel ran the supreme command of the German armed forces and turned the German military legal system into a machine for mass killing, one signed directive at a time. His paper trail at Nuremberg was so damning that even his own defense counsel struggled to find arguments in his favor. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal who signed murder into law. Wilhelm Keitel was born on September 22, 1882, in the village of Helmscherode in the Duchy of Brunswick, Germany. His father was a middle-class landowner. It was a stable, unremarkable upbringing in rural Germany, the kind that produced dutiful sons who joined institutions and followed rules. He became an officer cadet in the Prussian army in 1901 and joined a mounted field artillery regiment. When the First World War began in 1914, he served on the Western Front as a battery commander and staff officer. A shell fragment wounded him severely in Flanders in September 1914. He recovered, returned to service, and spent the rest of the war on the general's staff. He was competent, organized, and politically careful. He was not a battlefield hero. He was an administrator who understood military systems and knew how to make them run. After the war, he remained in the drastically reduced German army permitted under the Treaty of Versailles. He worked through the 1920s and early 1930s in staff and administrative positions, slowly accumulating seniority. By the time Hitler came to power in January 1933, Keitel had worked his way into the senior levels of the Defense Ministry bureaucracy. He was promoted to Major General in 1935 on the advice of Commander-in-Chief Werner von Fritsch. He was promoted again to General in 1937. In 1938, Hitler abolished the Reich Ministry of War and replaced it with the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, known by its German abbreviation. OKW Keitel was appointed its chief. From that moment, Wilhelm Keitel was the highest-ranking military officer in Germany beneath Hitler himself. On paper, he commanded all three branches of the German armed forces. In practice, Hitler immediately assumed direct supreme command, and Keitel became something else entirely. A conduit, a stamp of institutional legitimacy, a man whose signature made Hitler's instructions into official military orders. His fellow generals despised him for it. They gave him a nickname, Lakitel, a pun combining his surname with the German word Lakai, meaning lackey. He was Hitler's yes-man in uniform, and the officer corps knew it. When he expressed reservations about plans, as he occasionally did, he was overruled and he complied. He offered his resignation more than once. Hitler refused it. Keitel stayed and kept signing. What those signatures produced is the core of his case. In the spring and early summer of 1941, in the weeks before Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Keitel signed a series of orders that collectively dismantled the legal protections that had governed the conduct of war for decades and replaced them with a framework for systematic murder. The Commissar order was issued on June 6, 1941, 16 days before the invasion began. It ordered the immediate execution of all Soviet political commissars, Communist Party officials attached to Red Army units, upon capture. These men were soldiers in uniform. Under every convention of war then in existence, they were prisoners of war entitled to the protections of the Geneva Conventions. The Commissar order made their summary execution official German military policy. Keitel admitted at Nuremberg that the directive was passed on to field commanders. On May 13, 1941, 3 weeks before the Commissar order, Keitel had already signed a directive stating that Russian civilians suspected of offenses against German troops were to be shot without trial, and that prosecution of German soldiers for offenses against Russian civilians was not required. The order explicitly removed the legal obligation of German soldiers to answer for crimes committed against the Soviet civilian population. Then, on July 27, 1941, he ordered all copies of that directive destroyed, while simultaneously confirming that its contents remained valid. The order was to be followed but leave no paper trail. 4 days before the July 27th order, on July 23rd, Keitel signed another directive concerning the administration of occupied Russia. It stated that legal punishment was inadequate for so vast an area, and that troops should use terrorism to crush the will of the population to resist. These were not battlefield decisions made under pressure. These were policy documents prepared in offices, reviewed by lawyers, circulated through institutional channels, and signed by the Chief of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. They are bureaucratic in their language and genocidal in their effect. In the period between July and October 1941 alone, as a direct consequence of the institutional framework these orders created, approximately 600,000 Soviet prisoners of war in Wehrmacht custody were transferred to the SS and killed. They were soldiers who had surrendered. They were murdered. When German military lawyers raised objections in the summer and autumn of 1941, arguing that Soviet prisoners of war should be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, Keitel rejected them in writing. His response read, "These doubts correspond to military ideas about wars of chivalry. Our job is to suppress a way of life." It is one of the most explicit statements in the entire documentary record of any senior military official of the period. A direct written rejection of the laws of war, signed by the man responsible for enforcing them. The Night and Fog Decree came next. Hitler issued the instruction in December 1941. Keitel signed the implementing directive on December 7, 1941. The decree applied to occupied Western Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway. It stated that civilians arrested for resistance activities or sabotage were not to be tried locally and sentenced transparently. Instead, they were to be transferred secretly to Germany, tried by special courts if a death sentence was likely to be carried out within days of arrest, or simply handed to the Gestapo and made to disappear. Their families would receive no information. No notification of arrest. No notification of trial. No notification of execution. People would simply cease to exist, and the terror of not knowing, of a family member who went out one morning and never came back, was the deliberate mechanism of political control. The OKW placed a complete blackout on any information about the fate of those arrested under the decree. Families who inquired were told only that the proceedings did not allow further information. The absence of knowledge was the weapon. In October 1942, Keitel signed the commando order. Allied special operations soldiers, men dropped behind enemy lines, men operating in uniform, men who under every rule of war were entitled to prisoner of war status, were to be killed immediately upon capture, regardless of whether they were in uniform and regardless of whether they had surrendered. Keitel stated at Nuremberg that he did not believe the order was legal. He signed it anyway. After the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944, Keitel reaffirmed the commando order and later extended it to Allied soldiers fighting alongside partisan forces. He signed it again. He admitted it was illegal. He signed it again. The July 20th, 1944 bomb plot, the attempt by senior German officers to assassinate Hitler, failed. Keitel was in the room when the bomb went off. He survived, personally escorted the wounded Hitler from the wreckage, and then played a direct role in the aftermath. The conspirators who were arrested were handed to Roland Freisler's People's Court, a kangaroo court that had predetermined verdicts. Keitel signed orders transferring several of them. They were tried in show proceedings and executed, some by hanging on meat hooks with piano wire, filmed so Hitler could watch. Throughout all of this, Keitel remained in his post, attending Hitler's daily military conferences, signing directives, and functioning as the institutional face of the Wehrmacht's compliance with policies that murdered millions of people. He also signed orders directly connected to the Holocaust. As the deportations of Jews to extermination camps progressed in the spring and summer of 1942, Wehrmacht units in the occupied East had been using Jewish forced laborers for military construction and supply work. The SS wanted those workers handed over. Keitel's OKW signed off on the arrangements. Jews who had been working for the Wehrmacht were transferred to the SS. The destination was the death camps. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Keitel signed the German instrument of surrender at the ceremony in Berlin on that date, the final official act of the regime whose criminal orders he had spent 7 years signing. 5 days later, on May 13th, he was arrested. He was held at Camp Ashkan, the Allied detention facility in Luxembourg, and then transferred to Nuremberg to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal alongside 20 other senior Nazi leaders. His defense at Nuremberg was the same defense offered by nearly every German military figure who stood trial. He was a soldier following orders. He argued that a soldier's duty was obedience, that the responsibility for the orders he had signed lay with Hitler, not with him. The tribunal rejected this argument completely. The judgment stated clearly that the defense of superior orders was not available to a man who had signed those orders, transmitted them, and had the institutional authority to resist them. Keitel had that authority. He had offered his resignation. He had privately expressed reservations. He had then complied every single time. He was found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The verdict was unanimous. At sentencing, Keitel requested that he be shot by firing squad rather than hanged, a soldier's death rather than a criminal's. The request was denied. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On October 16, 1946, Wilhelm Keitel was hanged in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg courthouse. He was 63 years old. When the trapdoor opened, he struck his head on the edge of the drop, inflicting injuries before death came. His body was cremated and his ashes were scattered in the Isar River. He left behind a memoir written in his prison cell before the execution, in which he expressed regret and described himself as a man who had been too obedient for too long. It was a fair self-assessment. The problem was not that he lacked intelligence or understanding. The problem was that he understood exactly what he was signing and signed it anyway, every time, for 7 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next general on this list did not sign orders from a comfortable office in Berlin. He commanded men in the field across the forests and cities of Eastern Europe, overseeing the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews and civilians personally, sending progress reports back to headquarters with the casualty figures listed like crop yields. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski built his career on massacre, escaped full accountability at Nuremberg by becoming a prosecution witness, and died in a prison hospital in 1972, convicted only of murders he committed in Germany before the war even began. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, the SS general who got away with it. Erich Julius Eberhard von Zelewski was born on March 1, 1899, in Lauenburg, a small town in the province of Pomerania in what was then the German Empire. His parents were of Kashubian descent, a Slavic ethnic group from the region between Germany and Poland. This detail would later become an inconvenient fact that he spent considerable energy trying to bury. He volunteered for the Prussian army in November 1914 at the age of 15, becoming one of the youngest recruits in the German military. He served throughout the First World War, was wounded twice, and was awarded the Iron Cross. Like many young German soldiers of his generation, the war defined him completely. The years that followed, defeat, economic collapse, political chaos, radicalized him further. After the armistice, he joined a Freikorps unit and fought against Polish forces during the Silesian uprisings. By 1924, he had left the regular army, returned to farming in Pomerania, and joined the Der Stahlhelm Veterans Organization and the Deutsch Völkischer Schutz- und Trutzbund, the largest and most active anti-Semitic organization in Weimar-era Germany. In July 1930, he joined the Nazi Party. In February 1931, he joined the SS. He rose through the SS ranks with striking speed, reaching the rank of SS Brigade Führer by December 1933. Along the way, he legally added the aristocratic-sounding von dem Bach to his surname in October 1925, attempting to distance himself from the Polish-sounding Zalewski. In November 1940, he dropped Zalewski from his name entirely because he felt it sounded too Polish. An extraordinary act of self-erasure for a man about to spend years murdering Slavic people in Eastern Europe. There is one more detail worth noting about this period. In 1933, Bach-Zalewski was involved in the murder of 6 German communists. He would eventually be convicted of this crime, but not until 1962, 17 years after the war ended, and only after he had already escaped any accountability for the vastly larger crimes he committed during the war itself. By the time Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, Bach-Zalewski had been appointed higher SS and police leader for Russia Center, covering primarily the territory of Belarus. His job was to secure the rear areas behind the advancing German army, which in practice meant identifying and killing anyone the regime classified as a threat, a partisan, or simply an undesirable. He threw himself into the work with documented enthusiasm. From July through September 1941, he oversaw the operations of Einsatzgruppe B, the SS killing squad assigned to his area, led by Arthur Nebe. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile killing units that followed the German army into the Soviet Union specifically to murder Jews, Soviet officials, and others the regime had designated for death. Bach-Zalewski did not merely oversee these operations from a distance. He visited the killing sites. He attended mass executions. He sent regular cables back to headquarters in Berlin reporting the accumulated death counts as though reporting production figures from a factory. On August 22, 1941, he cabled headquarters. Thus, the figure in my area now exceeds the 30,000 mark. He was reporting the murder of more than 30,000 human beings as a milestone achievement. By October 31, 1941, after mass killings in Riga and across Belarus, he wrote with evident satisfaction that there was not a Jew left in Estonia. It was a statement of completion, a goal achieved, a task finished. The industrial scale of what he was overseeing began to affect even him. In February 1942, Bach-Zalewski was hospitalized in Berlin. The official diagnosis was intestinal ailments related to opium abuse. The deeper cause, noted by doctors who examined him, was that he was suffering from hallucinations connected with the shooting of Jews. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, visited him during his hospitalization. Bach-Zalewski recovered, was returned to service, and the killing continued. In July 1943, Himmler appointed him chief of anti-partisan units across the entire Eastern Front. This was a promotion that gave him command authority over all anti-partisan operations in German-occupied Eastern Europe. In practice, the anti-partisan campaigns under his direction were not primarily military operations against armed resistance fighters. They were organized massacres of civilian populations in which the German command classified entire villages, towns, and regions as partisan territory and killed the people living there. The body counts from the operations under his command during this period run into the hundreds of thousands. Mass executions in Belarus alone, a territory he had personally overseen from the beginning of Barbarossa, accounted for the deaths of an estimated 200,000 people or more, the vast majority of them unarmed civilians. Then came Warsaw. On August 1, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising, a massive armed revolt by the Polish underground against the German occupation of their capital city. The uprising caught the German command by surprise. Within the first days, Polish fighters had liberated most of Warsaw on the left bank of the Vistula River. Hitler's response was immediate and total. He did not hand the suppression of the uprising to the Wehrmacht generals he mistrusted. He handed it to Himmler and the SS. On August 2, 1944, Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski was placed in command of all German forces tasked with retaking Warsaw. The orders he received from Himmler were explicit. Warsaw was to be completely destroyed. The civilian population was to be exterminated. No distinction was to be made between fighters and civilians. Bach-Zelewski later testified that the order given by Hitler on the night of August 1st to 2nd stated, "Every inhabitant must be killed. No prisoners are to be taken." The forces placed under his command included 17,000 men organized into two battle groups. One of those groups included the SS Sonderregiment Dirlewanger, a unit composed of convicted criminals, assembled specifically because they could be relied upon to commit atrocities that regular soldiers might refuse. The Dirlewanger Brigade was commanded by Oskar Dirlewanger, a convicted child molester and sadist, whose unit's conduct during the war had been so extreme that even some senior SS officers had complained about it. The Wola massacre began on August 5, 1944, in the first days of the German counterattack. In the Warsaw district of Wola, German forces, primarily the Dirlewanger Brigade and the Kamiński Brigade, another unit of convicted criminals and collaborators, moved through the civilian population, killing systematically. Men, women, children, hospital patients, medical staff. Buildings were set on fire with people locked inside. Mass executions were carried out in courtyards, in streets, and in fields. In 3 days of slaughter in Wola alone, an estimated 40,000 civilians were killed. Oxford historian Martin Gilbert documented that more than 15,000 Polish civilians had been murdered by German troops in Warsaw in the initial days of the assault. On August 5th, Bach-Zelewski gave the order for the execution of women and children to stop. But the killing of all captured Polish men continued regardless, without any effort to distinguish between fighters and civilians. The Dirlewanger and Kamiński units did not follow even that limited order. The killing of women and children continued. Bach-Zelewski eventually had Kamiński shot, officially for looting, but the more credible explanation is that he was attempting to cover his own role in the atrocities by eliminating the most visible perpetrator. It was self-protection, not conscience. Over more than 2 months of fighting, the forces under Bach-Zelewski's command killed approximately 200,000 Warsaw civilians, more than 65,000 of them in direct mass executions. The city was systematically destroyed building by building. When the Polish Home Army finally surrendered on October 2, 1944, Bach-Zelewski accepted the surrender of General Tadeusz Bohr-Komorowski. For his role in crushing the uprising, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross by the Nazi regime on September 30, 1944. After Warsaw, Hitler sent him to Budapest, where he participated in the removal of Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy and the installation of the fascist Arrow Cross government, a transition that directly enabled the accelerated deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. Germany's defeat came in May 1945. Bach-Zelewski went into hiding and attempted to leave the country. U.S. military police arrested him on August 1, 1945. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary examples of judicial failure in the entire post-war period. Bach-Zelewski agreed to testify for the prosecution at the Nuremberg trials. He provided damaging testimony against Himmler, Göring, and other senior Nazi leaders. In exchange, the Americans refused to extradite him to Poland or to the Soviet Union, both of which wanted to try him for the mass murders committed on their territory. He did not stand trial at Nuremberg as a defendant. He sat in the witness box instead. He left prison in 1949. In 1951, a Munich denazification court sentenced him to 10 years of special labor for murdering political opponents before the war. A sentence that in practice meant confinement to his own home in Franconia, not imprisonment. In 1961, he was convicted of manslaughter for his participation in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 and sentenced to 4.5 years. In 1962, he was tried again, this time for the murder of 6 German communists in 1933, and received a life sentence. He died in a prison hospital in Munich on March 8, 1972, 1 week after his 73rd birthday. The man who oversaw the murder of tens of thousands of Jews in Belarus, who commanded the forces that killed 200,000 civilians in Warsaw, who sent progress reports to Berlin counting his victims in the tens of thousands, died in prison for killing 6 people in Germany before the war began. The crimes for which he was actually imprisoned were, by any measure, the smallest fraction of what the documented record shows he did. He was never prosecuted for the mass killings in Belarus. He was never prosecuted for the Warsaw Uprising massacres. He was never prosecuted for the Wola massacre. The decision by the American authorities to use him as a prosecution witness at Nuremberg and the subsequent refusal to extradite him to Poland or the Soviet Union ensured that the full account was never put to a court. Historians have access to his cables, his orders, his own testimony, and his own post-war interviews. The record is not ambiguous. He knew what he was doing, he reported it in writing, and he did it for years across thousands of miles of occupied territory. The next general on this list also escaped full accountability, but not by cooperating with prosecutors. Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, was hanged for the crimes of troops he claimed were beyond his control, while the broader question of what his forces did to the Filipino civilian population across the entire Philippine archipelago remained only partially examined by the tribunal that condemned him. Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya and the Ruins of Manila. Tomoyuki Yamashita was born on November 8, 1885, in the small village of Osugi in Kochi Prefecture on the island of Shikoku, Japan. His father was a rural doctor. He grew up in a modest household far removed from the military aristocracy that dominated the upper ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army. Getting to the top of that institution from where he started required exceptional ability, and Yamashita had it. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1906 and from the Army Staff College in 1916. He served as a military attaché in Switzerland and Germany during the 1920s, developing a detailed understanding of European military doctrine and a particular respect for German organizational methods. He was physically large by Japanese standards, methodical in his planning, and known within the Army as a commander who studied problems carefully before committing to a course of action. He also had enemies. His career was repeatedly interrupted by the intense factional politics that ran through the Imperial Japanese Army like a fault line. He was associated with the Imperial WWII faction, a group within the army that clashed repeatedly with the rival Control faction led by men like Hideki Tojo. When the February 26th incident occurred in 1936, a coup attempt by young Imperial WWII officers who assassinated several senior government officials. Yamashita was suspected of sympathy with the rebels, though he had not participated directly. Tojo, who opposed the coup, never forgot the association. The result was that despite his obvious military talent, Yamashita spent years being assigned to posts far from the centers of power. He was sent to Korea, then to Manchuria, then dispatched on a military mission to Germany and Italy in 1940 to study the Wehrmacht's methods. When he returned and reported that Germany was too strong for Japan to risk war with the United States, his assessment was ignored and his career suffered further. By late 1941, however, Japan needed its best commanders. Yamashita was given command of the 25th Army and assigned the task of capturing British Malaya and Singapore, the most heavily fortified British base in Asia, a fortress the British military establishment considered impregnable. He proved them spectacularly wrong. On December 8, 1941, one day after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces under Yamashita landed on the northeast coast of Malaya and began driving south. What followed was one of the most stunning campaigns in the history of modern warfare. Yamashita's troops moved faster than British commanders believed was possible, cycling infantry through the jungle on bicycles, outflanking defensive positions before they could be consolidated, and maintaining momentum that gave the British no time to organize an effective defense. In 70 days, Yamashita's forces covered the length of the Malay Peninsula and reached the causeway connecting Malaya to Singapore Island. On February 8, 1942, Japanese troops crossed onto the island. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore and approximately 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops to Yamashita, the largest surrender of British-commanded forces in history. Yamashita conducted his surrender negotiations with deliberate speed, partly because his forces were actually running low on ammunition and he could not afford a prolonged siege. His blunt demand, surrender or the bombardment continues, was a calculated bluff that worked. The fall of Singapore shocked the British Empire and made Yamashita famous overnight. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. What happened in the aftermath of Singapore's fall, however, belonged to the darkest chapter of the campaign. The Suk Ching massacre followed immediately. Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, conducted a systematic screening of the ethnic Chinese population of Singapore. Chinese men between the ages of 18 and 50 were assembled at collection points and screened for signs of anti-Japanese sentiment, which in practice meant that the criteria were arbitrary and the outcomes were determined by individual screeners who could send a man to his death based on nothing more than suspicion or caprice. Those selected were taken to beaches and remote areas outside the city and shot. The official Japanese figure for those killed was 5,000. The Singapore government's historical assessment puts the figure between 25,000 and 50,000. The massacre lasted approximately 2 weeks. Yamashita was in overall command of Singapore at the time. His star rose after Singapore and then almost immediately fell again, for reasons that had nothing to do with military performance. Tojo, now Prime Minister and Minister of War, had not forgotten his factional associations. Yamashita was transferred to Manchuria and given command of the 1st Area Army, a posting to a quiet theater far from the active fighting, which in the context of Japanese military politics was the equivalent of being put in a drawer. He remained in Manchuria for 2 years while the war turned against Japan. Island after island fell to American forces. In October 1944, with the Philippines under direct threat from MacArthur's returning army, Japan needed its best commander in the Pacific. Tojo had been forced to resign 3 months earlier after the fall of Saipan. The political obstacle was gone. Yamashita was pulled from Manchuria and assigned command of the 14th Area Army in the Philippines. He arrived in Manila on October 9, 1944. American forces landed at Leyte Gulf 10 days later. Yamashita understood his situation clearly from the moment he arrived. He did not have enough men, enough aircraft, or enough supplies to defend the entire Philippine archipelago against what the Americans were bringing. His strategy was to conduct a fighting withdrawal into the mountains of northern Luzon, tying down as many American troops as possible for as long as possible, and making the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands as costly as he could. He had no illusions about the final outcome. Manila, he decided, was not worth defending. The city had a large civilian population, no strategic value that outweighed the cost of fighting for it, and was surrounded by terrain that offered no defensive advantage. He ordered the military garrison to evacuate northward and declared his intention to make Manila an open city, a designation under international law that meant the city would not be defended and therefore should not be attacked. What happened next unraveled everything. Imperial Japanese Navy Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi received Yamashita's orders to evacuate but did not comply. Iwabuchi had approximately 16,000 naval troops under his command in Manila, plus roughly 3,750 Army security troops. He decided to stay, destroy the port facilities and naval infrastructure, and fight to the last. He turned Manila into a fortress. The Battle of Manila lasted from February 3rd to March 3rd, 1945. American forces fought their way into the city block by block while Yamashita was in the mountains of northern Luzon, increasingly unable to communicate with or control the forces inside the city. What Iwabuchi's troops did to the civilian population of Manila during those weeks constitutes one of the most extensively documented urban massacres of the Second World War. Filipino civilians were killed in their homes, in churches, in hospitals, and in the streets. The Bayview Hotel was used as a documented rape center where women and girls, some as young as 12 years old, were rounded up, selected, and gang-raped by Japanese soldiers. Infants were bayoneted. Civilians who sought refuge in the German club were bayoneted alongside their children while begging for mercy. Women who had been gang-raped were doused in gasoline and set on fire. The Red Cross building, clearly marked and internationally protected, was attacked. The De La Salle College was entered and its occupants were massacred. St. Paul's College was entered and civilians sheltering there were killed. By the time American forces cleared the last Japanese resistance on March 3, 1945, more than 100,000 Filipino civilians had been killed. Manila had been one of the great cities of Asia. It emerged from the battle as rubble. The destruction was comparable in scale to Warsaw. Yamashita continued fighting in the mountains of Luzon until the emperor's surrender message reached him in August 1945. He obeyed the order and surrendered on September 2, 1945. The same day, Japan formally surrendered to the Allied powers aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He was taken to Baguio City by helicopter on September 3rd and formally signed surrender documents at Camp John Hay. 2 months later, on October 29, 1945, his war crimes trial opened in Manila before an American military commission of 5 generals. The speed with which the trial was convened, barely 7 weeks after his surrender, drew immediate criticism from legal observers. His defense team consisted of American military lawyers, none of whom had criminal trial experience. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The charge against Yamashita was command responsibility. Prosecutors argued that the atrocities committed by troops under his command. In Manila, in Batangas province, where 0 civilians were massacred by army units. In the Palawan massacre, where 139 American prisoners of war were burned alive, were so widespread and systematic that Yamashita must have known about them or should have known, and failed in his duty as a commander to prevent them. His defense argued that he had been physically isolated in the mountains of Luzon, that American air supremacy had destroyed his communications infrastructure, that the Manila atrocities were committed by Navy units outside his chain of command, and that he had specifically ordered the city not to be defended. Several of these arguments had genuine legal merit, particularly regarding the Navy's role in Manila. The commission rejected them. On December 7, 1945, the 4th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, Yamashita was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. His lawyers appealed immediately to the Philippine Supreme Court and then to the United States Supreme Court. 2 Supreme Court justices, Frank Murphy and Wiley Rutledge, issued dissenting opinions calling the trial a miscarriage of justice. Justice Murphy wrote that the proceedings had taken the form of a hasty, revengeful, and un-American trial that violated the basic concepts of procedural due process. Justice Rutledge called the trial a denial of the most fundamental protections a man facing death deserves. General Douglas MacArthur, who had the authority to review and modify the sentence, confirmed it without change. MacArthur stated that he had reviewed the proceedings in vain, searched for some mitigating circumstance on Yamashita's behalf, and could find none. That MacArthur, whose own retreat from the Philippines in 1942, abandoning his troops to the Bataan Death March, remained a controversial episode, was the man confirming the execution added another layer of legal and historical complexity to a case that has never been fully resolved among military law scholars. On February 23, 1946, Tomoyuki Yamashita was hanged at Los Banos prison camp, 30 miles south of Manila. He was 60 years old. Before his execution, he issued a statement expressing sorrow for the suffering his army had caused the Filipino people. His remains were initially buried near the prison camp and later moved to Tama Cemetery in Tokyo. His trial produced the Yamashita Standard, the legal doctrine that a commander bears criminal responsibility for crimes committed by forces under his command if he knew or should have known about them and failed to prevent them. This standard was incorporated into the Geneva Conventions and has been applied in international criminal tribunals from Nuremberg's successors through to the International Criminal Court. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next general on this list commanded forces that committed atrocities on a smaller geographic scale than Yamashita, but whose personal role in ordering and directing the murder of prisoners was so direct and so extensively documented that his guilt was never in serious legal dispute. Masaharu Homma sent 76,000 starving prisoners on a forced march through Philippine heat that killed thousands of them, and was executed for it. while the staff officer who countermanded his orders and personally directed the worst of the killing escaped all accountability entirely. Masaharu Homma, the Beast of Bataan and the March that Killed Thousands. Masaharu Homma was born on November 27, 1887, on Sato Island, a remote island in the Sea of Japan off the coast of Niigata Prefecture. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1907 and from the Army Staff College in 1915. From the beginning of his career, he was different from most of his contemporaries in ways that would define both his military service and his eventual fate. He spent 8 years as a military attaché in the United Kingdom, a longer posting than almost any other Japanese officer of his generation. He was attached to the East Lancashire Regiment in 1917 and served with the British Expeditionary Force in France in 1918, for which he was awarded the British Military Cross. He attended the Paris Peace Conference as part of the Japanese delegation in 1919. He wrote poetry, he painted. He attended the theater and developed a genuine passion for English literature and Western culture that his colleagues in the Imperial Japanese Army regarded with deep suspicion. By the standards of the institution he served in, Masaharu Homma was dangerously westernized. He believed in conserving the lives of his own soldiers rather than spending them in frontal assaults. He believed in treating enemy civilians with respect rather than contempt. These were not views that made him popular with superiors who had built careers on the opposite philosophy. He rose through the ranks regardless, appointed to command the Japanese forces in North China in 1938, and later serving in various staff and command positions through the late 1930s. By 1941, he held the rank of lieutenant general and commanded the 14th Army, which was assigned the task of invading and capturing the Philippine Islands following the attack on Pearl Harbor. His instructions for the treatment of Filipino civilians were explicit from the outset. He ordered his troops to treat Filipinos not as enemies but as friends, to respect their customs and religious practices, and to behave as liberators rather than conquerors. This immediately earned him the hostility of his superior, General Hisaichi Terauchi, who filed negative reports on Homma's performance and attitude. Many within the Japanese military hierarchy believed Homma had been contaminated by his years in the West and cared too much about things that soldiers were not supposed to care about. The main Japanese landings at Lingayen Gulf, north of Manila, came on December 22, 1941. Homma commanded the operation. The plan was straightforward: drive south, capture Manila, and secure the Philippines within 50 days. Imperial General Headquarters had given him that timetable. It was a timetable built on the assumption that American and Filipino forces would collapse quickly once the Japanese landed in strength. They did not collapse. General Douglas MacArthur's forces, though ultimately unable to hold Manila, conducted a planned withdrawal into the Bataan Peninsula that Homma had failed to anticipate. Bataan is a heavily jungled peninsula on the western side of Manila Bay, mountainous and defensible. MacArthur had prepared contingency plans for exactly this withdrawal years earlier, even though he had publicly dismissed those plans as defeatist when he took command. Homma's 50-day timetable fell apart immediately. The American and Filipino forces dug into Bataan and held. His best infantry division was replaced by a poorly trained reserve brigade. His supply lines were stretched. His casualty rates were climbing. Tokyo was furious. Army Chief of Staff Hajime Sugiyama cabled him repeatedly, pressing him to attack harder regardless of losses. One of Homma's own staff officers, Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, became a particular problem. Tsuji was a fanatic who held Homma's moderation in contempt. He operated semi-independently within Homma's command, issuing orders in Homma's name without Homma's knowledge or approval. Tsuji attempted to have a former Philippine Supreme Court justice executed on his own authority. He attempted to have the former Speaker of the Philippine House of Representatives killed. Homma found out and stopped both executions. The fact that a staff officer within his own command was issuing unauthorized execution orders without his knowledge was a preview of the command and control failures that would define the Bataan Death March. The Battle of Bataan lasted from January 7, 1942 to April 9, 1942. 99 days. American and Filipino troops fought with extraordinary tenacity on rations cut to half and then to a quarter of normal levels, riddled with malaria and dysentery, receiving no reinforcements and no resupply because the Japanese naval blockade made relief impossible. MacArthur had already been ordered by President Roosevelt to evacuate to Australia, which he did on March 11, 1942, leaving his forces under the command of General Jonathan Wainwright. By early April, the situation was hopeless. The men were starving, sick, and exhausted beyond the point of effective resistance. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King made the decision to surrender. It was the largest surrender of American commanded forces in history. Approximately 12,000 American soldiers and 63,000 Filipino soldiers laid down their arms. Hama's headquarters had estimated the number of prisoners at approximately 25,000. The actual number was more than 3 times that figure. There was almost no mechanized transport available to move them. The men were already in desperate physical condition from months of siege on starvation rations. They were weak with malaria and dysentery. Many were wounded. The plan Hama approved called for the prisoners to be marched approximately 65 miles north from Mariveles at the tip of the Bataan Peninsula to the town of San Fernando, where they would board trains to Camp O'Donnell, a prison camp in central Luzon. The plan was based on prisoner numbers and physical conditions that no longer existed. It was catastrophically inadequate from the moment it was implemented. What happened on that march over the following days became known to the world as the Bataan Death March. Prisoners were given almost no food and almost no water for the entire duration of the march. The April heat in the Philippines is brutal. Temperatures regularly exceed 38 degrees Celsius. Men who fell from exhaustion were beaten. Men who stopped to drink from streams or puddles were beaten or shot. Men who fell and could not get up were bayoneted where they lay or shot by guards who did not want to wait. Filipino civilians who attempted to pass food or water to the prisoners through the roadside crowds were beaten. The Pantingan River Massacre occurred early in the march when Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, acting entirely on his own authority and against Hama's standing orders, directed the summary execution of approximately 350 to 400 Filipino officers and non-commissioned officers who had already surrendered. They were marched to the riverbank, bound, and killed. Tsuji issued these orders in Hama's name. Hama did not know about them. Death was not uniformly distributed. Some prisoners encountered guards who gave them water or looked away when civilians passed food. Others encountered guards who killed for sport or to relieve their own frustrations from weeks of costly fighting. The randomness of survival made the experience more terrifying rather than less. There was no way to predict which guard or which moment might be your last. The march took between 5 and 12 days, depending on where a prisoner started and what route they traveled. By the time survivors reached Camp O'Donnell, thousands had already died. The camp itself was wholly inadequate, designed for a fraction of the number of prisoners it now held, with almost no medical facilities, contaminated water, and food supplies that amounted to starvation rations. In the weeks following the march, prisoners continued dying at the rate of hundreds per day from disease, starvation, and the accumulated physical destruction of months of siege followed by the march itself. Estimates of the total death toll during the march vary significantly across sources. The most commonly cited figures are between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipino deaths, and between 500 and 650 American deaths during the march itself. Many thousands more died in the camps in the weeks that followed. Hama did not learn the full extent of what had happened on the march until approximately 2 months after it ended. By then, he had moved on to the assault on Corregidor Island, where the remaining American forces in the Philippines were holding out. Corregidor fell on May 6, 1942. By August 1942, the relationship between Hama and his superiors had deteriorated completely. Imperial General Headquarters considered him insufficiently aggressive and too lenient with the Filipino population. He was relieved of command, returned to Japan, and spent the remainder of the war in effective retirement, holding no further combat commands. Japan surrendered in August 1945. American occupation authorities arrested Hama in mid-September 1945 and extradited him to the Philippines, where he was arraigned on December 19, 1945, on 48 counts of violating international rules of war. His trial opened on January 3, 1946, at the High Commissioner's residence in Manila. His defense team consisted of 6 American military lawyers. None of them had experience in criminal law. The prosecution was given considerable latitude by the commission to admit hearsay evidence and testimony that would not have been permitted in a civilian court. Hama's defense rested on 3 arguments. First, that he had not ordered the atrocities of the march. Second, that he had not known about them as they occurred. Third, that when he did learn of what had happened, he had been immediately removed from effective command by the circumstances of the Corregidor campaign. The prosecution presented witness after witness describing the killings, the beatings, and the deliberate withholding of food and water. One witness, Sergeant James Baldassari, a survivor of the march, testified that he had seen Hama riding in an official car along the Death March route, directly placing the general at the scene of the atrocities. Military historians have since noted that this identification was almost certainly mistaken, as very few American soldiers at the time knew what Hama looked like. But Baldassari stuck to his testimony, and it was powerful. General Douglas MacArthur, who had the authority to appoint the commission, select the prosecutors, and review the verdict, was not a disinterested party. He was the man who had commanded the forces on Bataan, who had been ordered to evacuate and had left his men behind, and who had publicly referred to his eventual return to the Philippines as a personal mission. Whether his involvement in the trial process constituted a conflict of interest that compromised its fairness is a question that military law scholars have debated for decades. On February 11, 1946, Hama was convicted of all counts. He was sentenced to be shot to death with musketry, a firing squad, which under military tradition carried more honor than hanging. The sentence was reviewed by MacArthur, who confirmed it. Hama's wife, Fujiko, traveled to MacArthur's headquarters and appealed personally for her husband's life. Her appeal was denied. Appeals to the United States Supreme Court were also denied, though the court's decision drew dissenting opinions from Justices Frank Murphy and Wiley Rutledge, who argued that the proceedings had fallen short of the standards of due process that American justice required. On April 3, 1946, Masaharu Hama was executed by firing squad outside Manila. He was 58 years old. His final diary entry, written in the days before his execution, read, "There is no hope at all that I will be saved. There is no possibility. At night, I feel dizzy from despair. The man who actually countermanded Hama's orders, who personally directed the Pantingan River massacre, and who issued unauthorized execution orders throughout the campaign, Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, was never tried. He disguised himself as a Buddhist monk after Japan's surrender, fled through Thailand and China, returned to Japan in 1949, wrote a best-selling memoir, was elected to the Japanese parliament, and disappeared in Laos in 1961. His fate was never confirmed. The next general on this list did not face the ambiguities of command responsibility that complicated the cases of Homa and Yamashita. Walter Model personally ordered the deportation of entire civilian populations, personally directed the poisoning of wells and the razing of villages across hundreds of miles of Russian territory, and shot himself in a German forest in April 1945, when he learned the Soviets had indicted him for the deaths of 577,000 people. Choosing a bullet over the courtroom he knew he could not survive. Walter Model, the field marshal who burned his way across Russia. Walter Model was born on January 24, 1891, in the small town of Genthin in the Prussian province of Saxony. His father was a music teacher, later a school director, a middle-class, educated household with no military tradition. Model chose the army anyway, entering officer cadet school in Nisei in 1909 and receiving his commission as a lieutenant in 1910. He served on the Western Front throughout the First World War, was severely wounded in 1915, and spent the latter part of the war on the general staff. He emerged from the conflict with 2 Iron Crosses, a reputation for aggressive competence, and the kind of political instincts that told him which way institutional winds were blowing. He stayed in the drastically reduced post-war German army, worked through staff and training positions during the 1920s and 1930s, and developed a deep interest in armored warfare and mechanized operations that positioned him well for the coming conflict. He was not a Nazi in the formal sense. He never joined the party. But he was a German nationalist with a strong authoritarian streak, a contempt for what he saw as weakness in military leadership, and a willingness to use the Nazi regime to advance his own career and prosecute the kind of war he believed Germany needed to fight. Historian Stephen Newton, who studied Model extensively, described him as a man who saw Hitler as the strong leader Germany required and whose racial prejudices against Slavs and Jews were consistent with the broader German officer corps of his generation, not fanatical but functional and never an obstacle to carrying out criminal orders. His relationship with Hitler became close in 1942, after Model had demonstrated an ability to stabilize collapsing front lines that no other German commander seemed to possess. Hitler began calling him his best defensive commander. He sent him to crisis points the way a contractor sends his best specialist to a building that is falling down. The nickname that stuck was the Führer's fireman. What that nickname obscures is what Model left behind every time he moved through Russian territory. By early 1942, Model commanded the 9th Army, positioned in the Rzhev salient, a bulge in the German front line west of Moscow that the Soviets hammered repeatedly in a series of costly offensives. Model held it. The battles around Rzhev between 1942 and 1943 were among the bloodiest of the entire Eastern Front. Soviet casualties numbered in the millions. German casualties were staggering as well. Model's ability to hold the salient against repeated Soviet attacks made him a legend within the Wehrmacht. But holding the Rzhev salient required anti-partisan operations in the surrounding territory that went far beyond anything that could be described as military necessity. In the weeks before the 9th Army evacuated the salient in March 1943, as part of a planned withdrawal to shorten the German line, Model ordered a series of anti-partisan sweeps across the territory his army was about to abandon. The documented results of those sweeps tell a precise story. An estimated 3,000 Russians were killed in the weeks immediately preceding the withdrawal. The inventory of weapons seized from those 3,000 dead was recorded and survived the war. 277 rifles, 41 pistols, 61 machine guns, 17 mortars, 9 anti-tank rifles, and 16 small artillery pieces. The arithmetic is straightforward. Roughly 0 people were killed. They collectively possessed fewer weapons than a single understrength infantry company. The great majority of them were unarmed civilians. The withdrawal itself was precisely planned and executed over 2 weeks with minimal German casualties, a logistical achievement involving approximately 300,000 men, 100 tanks, and 400 artillery pieces. In its wake, Model personally ordered the deportation of all male civilians from the evacuated territory. He ordered wells poisoned. He ordered at least 24 villages burned to the ground. The explicit purpose was to deny the advancing Soviet forces any logistical support. Food, water, shelter, or labor from the civilian population that remained. British war correspondent Alexander Werth entered the area shortly after Soviet forces retook it and documented what he found. The landscape Model had left behind was not a military zone. It was a territory that had been systematically stripped of everything that could sustain human life. The pattern repeated itself on a larger scale in the summer of 1943, following the failure of Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk. Model had commanded the Northern Assault Force and had been skeptical of the plan from the start, correctly predicting that Soviet defenses were too strong. When the offensive stalled and the Soviet counterattack pushed the Germans back, Model oversaw the withdrawal from the Oral salient. His orders were the same as at Rzhev: scorched earth, destroyed infrastructure, burned harvests, poisoned water sources. This time, the deportation figure was not measured in thousands. Model ordered the deportation of 250,000 civilians from the Oral salient under what were documented as inhuman conditions. These were not SS operations that Model passively permitted. These were direct personal orders issued by the commander of the 9th Army to his troops. The distinction matters. Model was not looking the other way while subordinates committed crimes. He was directing the crimes himself, in writing, as official military policy. At various points in 1944, Model commanded Army Group North Ukraine, and Army Group Center. At one stage simultaneously holding two of these commands at the same time, coming closer than any other German officer to commanding the entire Eastern Front. Every command he held operated under the same framework he had established at Gève and Orel. Anti-partisan sweeps produced mass civilian casualties. Withdrawals produced scorched earth and civilian deportations. The scale of what happened under his command across the entire Eastern Front between 1942 and 1944 was documented by Soviet investigators who compiled evidence throughout and after the war. The Soviet indictment against him, which he learned of in the final days of the war, specified the deaths of 577,000 people in concentration camps in Latvia during the period when he commanded Army Group North, and the deportation of 175,000 others as slave labor. These were not approximations or propaganda figures produced after the fact. They were based on documentary evidence that Soviet forces had been collecting since they began retaking occupied territory. In August 1944, with the Eastern Front collapsing and the Western Front opened by the Allied landings in Normandy, Hitler transferred Model to the west. He replaced Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge as commander of both Army Group B and OB West, the overall German command in the Western Theater. The Normandy front had already broken. American armored forces were driving for the Seine. An entire German army group was in danger of annihilation in the Falaise pocket. Model stabilized the situation sufficiently to prevent complete catastrophe, extracting significant forces from the Falaise pocket before it closed completely and establishing a new defensive line. He was a genuinely exceptional defensive commander, and the Allied advance that had seemed unstoppable in late August was slowed considerably by September. This military competence existed simultaneously with and completely independent of his criminal conduct in the East. The two were not in tension in his mind. They were simply different aspects of the same job. In December 1944, he commanded the German forces during the Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive in the West, launched through the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The offensive initially achieved significant surprise and penetration, but stalled within days when weather cleared and Allied air power resumed operations. By January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated and German forces were back roughly where they had started, having expended irreplaceable men, fuel, and equipment. From that point, the German position in the West deteriorated continuously. By March 1945, American forces had crossed the Rhine. In early April 1945, the American 1st and 9th Armies completed an encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region, trapping Model's Army Group B, approximately 300,000 German troops, in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Model refused to surrender formally. He dissolved Army Group B on April 15, 1945, releasing the youngest and oldest soldiers and granting the remaining men leave to surrender or attempt to break out individually at their own discretion. Roughly 317,000 German soldiers surrendered to American forces in the Ruhr Pocket over the following days, one of the largest mass surrenders on the Western Front. On April 20, 1945, Joseph Goebbels publicly denounced Army Group B as traitors to the Reich. It was the regime's final act of contempt toward the man who had spent 3 years being its most reliable military instrument. Model had already made his decision. He had burned all his personal papers, an act that historians have noted made it significantly more difficult to document his early life and his private views. He said to his staff before dissolving his command, "What is there left for a commander in defeat? In antiquity, they took poison." On April 21, 1945, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg in the western Ruhr region and shot himself in the head. He was 54 years old. He was buried where he fell, in a field grave in the forest. In 1955, his body was exhumed and reburied at the German military cemetery at Wassenach in the Hürtgen forest. He never faced trial. He never answered formally for the 3,000 civilians killed in the Rzhev sweeps, for the 250,000 deported from the Oral salient, for the 577,000 deaths the Soviets documented in Latvia, or for the 175,000 people sent to slave labor under his command. The Soviet Union had declared him a war criminal. The Western Allies had placed him on their own lists. The Nuremberg Tribunal received evidence about the crimes of the Ninth Army. None of it resulted in a trial because the man who should have sat in the dock had put a bullet in his own head in a German forest 9 days before Hitler did the same. His decision to commit suicide was not an act of honor in any meaningful sense. It was the act of a man who had reviewed the evidence against him and calculated the result. He had seen what happened to Keitel at Nuremberg. He had seen what the Soviets did with the commanders they captured. He knew precisely what the documented record showed he had done, and he chose the forest over the courtroom. The Soviet indictment against him named 577,000 dead. His own orders, signed and transmitted through official military channels, documented the deportation of 250,000 civilians in a single operation. The weapons inventory from the Rzhev sweeps, 277 rifles for 3,000 dead, told the story more precisely than any post-war tribunal could have. He was, in the assessment of the Soviet prosecutors who built the case against him, a war criminal of the first order. He agreed with that assessment sufficiently to ensure they never got the chance to prove it in court. __quote_6__. The next general on this list did not escape into a forest. Mario Rowata, the Italian general the Yugoslavs called the Black Beast, built concentration camps on Adriatic islands, ordered the burning of entire villages, and told his commanders that the correct ratio of reprisal was not a tooth for a tooth, but a head for a tooth. Then spent the post-war decades in comfortable exile in Spain, while the survivors of his camps received no compensation, and his extradition requests were blocked by British officials trying to keep Italy anti-communist. Mario Rowata, the Black Beast of Yugoslavia. Mario Rowata was born on February 2, 1887, in Modena, in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. His father was a captain in the Royal Italian Army. The military household shaped him from the start. He entered the Military Academy of Modena, one of the oldest military academies in the world, at age 17, graduated on September 14, 1906, and was accepted into the army as a second lieutenant, initially stationed in Turin. He served in the First World War on the Albanian, French, and Austrian fronts, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel by the war's end. During the interwar years, he served as a military attaché in Warsaw, Helsinki, and Berlin, developing the kind of multilingual, multi-theater experience that made him valuable to the Italian military establishment. He was intelligent, ambitious, and politically attuned in ways that most soldiers were not. He learned early that in Mussolini's Italy, military advancement required navigating the fascist party's priorities as carefully as it required military competence. From 1934 to 1936, he served as head of the Italian Military Intelligence Service, the Servizio Informazioni Militari, or SIM. In that role, he was directly involved in one of the most notorious political assassinations of the decade. In June 1937, Carlo and Nello Rosselli, two prominent Italian anti-fascist intellectuals living in exile in France, were murdered by French far-right militants working under contract. The operation was masterminded by Rowata's intelligence service. The Rosselli brothers were stabbed and bludgeoned to death on a road in Normandy. Rowata was later tried for his role in their murders, though the full judicial accounting of his involvement was repeatedly delayed and ultimately incomplete. During the Spanish Civil War, from late 1936 to early 1937, Rowata commanded the Corpo Truppe Volontarie, the Italian expeditionary force sent to support Francisco Franco's nationalist forces. He commanded up to 72,000 Italian troops at the peak of the deployment. The campaign produced mixed results. Italian forces achieved success at the Battle of Malaga in February 1937, but suffered a significant defeat at the Battle of Guadalajara in March 1937, where Republican forces supported by Soviet equipment stopped the Italian advance cold. Rowata was replaced after Guadalajara. He returned to Italy and continued his rise. By October 1939, he was Deputy Chief of Staff of the Italian Army, and by March 1941, he was its Chief of Staff. In September 1940, he had already begun preparing the operational plans for Italy's participation in the invasion of Yugoslavia. When Germany and Italy dismembered Yugoslavia in April 1941, Rowata was directly involved in planning the Italian component of the operation. On January 19, 1942, Rowata was given command of the Italian Second Army in the occupied Yugoslav territories, specifically in the Slovenia and Croatia regions that Italy had annexed or occupied. He was 54 years old, an experienced intelligence chief and expeditionary commander, and he arrived in Yugoslavia with a clear philosophy about how occupied populations should be managed. That philosophy is documented in his own words. In May 1942, Mussolini told Rowata directly, "The best situation is when the enemy is dead. So we must take numerous hostages and shoot them whenever necessary." Rowata did not resist this instruction. He systematized it. On March 1, 1942, 6 weeks after taking command, Rowata issued Circular 3C, a document distributed down to battalion command level across all Italian-occupied Yugoslav territories. Academic historian James Burgwyn, writing in the Journal of Modern Italian Studies, described it as a manifesto for repression in the Yugoslav territories. It was not a vague policy statement. It was a detailed operational framework authorizing and directing summary executions, hostage-taking, collective reprisals against civilian populations, mass internment in concentration camps, the burning of houses and entire villages, and the scorched earth destruction of agricultural resources. Rowata's own language in the circular was explicit. He told his commanders, "If necessary, don't shy away from using cruelty. It must be a complete cleansing." He described the objective as de-Balkanization and ethnic clearance of the Slovene-inhabited areas under Italian control. His personal formulation for the reprisal ratio became notorious among his own officers. When Rowata said the correct response to resistance was not a tooth for a tooth, but a head for a tooth, he was not speaking metaphorically. He was setting a numerical and proportional standard for how many civilians should die in response to any act of resistance against Italian forces. The internment program that followed Circular 3C was one of the largest mass deportations in occupied Europe outside the German-controlled territories. During the 22 months of the Italian occupation of the province of Ljubljana alone, from June 1941 to September 1943, Rowata ordered the deportation of 25,000 people. This figure represented 7.5% of the total population of the province. It was not a targeted operation against known resistance fighters. Entire families were interned if any male member was absent without what Italian authorities considered an adequate explanation. Women and children were deported alongside men. Families suspected of contact with partisans had their food ration cards confiscated and their non-essential goods eliminated, a deliberate starvation mechanism applied to civilians as collective punishment. The deportees were sent to Italian concentration camps scattered across the Adriatic region. The main camps were on the island of Rab, the Rab concentration camp, and at Gonars, Monigo near Treviso, Renici, D'Anghiari, and Chiesa Nuova. The conditions in these camps were catastrophic. Historian James Walston at the American University of Rome and historian Carlo Spartaco Capogreco both documented that the annual death rate in the Rab concentration camp was higher than the average mortality rate in Buchenwald, the German concentration camp in central Germany that became one of the symbols of Nazi terror. The Italian camp on a Croatian island, run under Rowata's command framework, killed its inmates at a higher rate than one of the most notorious camps in the Nazi system. The survivors of these camps received no compensation from the Italian state after the war. None. The testimony from inside the occupied territories during this period is consistent across multiple independent sources. One of Rowata's soldiers wrote home on July 1, 1942, "We have destroyed everything from top to bottom without sparing the innocent. We kill entire families every night, beating them to death or shooting them." This was not an isolated soldier's private confession. It described the standard operating procedure that Circular 3C had institutionalized. Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano recorded in his diary a meeting with the Secretary General of the Fascist Party, who had expressed a desire for the Italian army to kill all Slovenes. When Ciano noted that there were approximately 1 million Slovenes, the response was, "It doesn't matter. We should model ourselves on the Eritrean auxiliary troops, infamous for their cruelty, and wipe them out." Ciano recorded this without apparent protest. The Yugoslav partisan resistance under Josip Broz Tito grew stronger rather than weaker under the pressure of Italian reprisals. Rowata's response to this reality was not to reconsider his methods, but to request more resources to apply them more completely. In one planning document, he proposed the closure of entire regions, the evacuation of civilian populations from border areas to a distance of several kilometers inland, and the mass internment of 20 to 30,000 additional persons in Italian concentration camps. He also managed the complex political relationships between the Italian occupation forces, the German military presence in Yugoslavia, and the Croatian Ustasha regime, a fascist puppet government that was simultaneously conducting its own genocide against Serbs, Jews, and Roma within its territory. Rowata's relationship with the Ustasha was instrumentally pragmatic. He armed Serbian Chetnik forces to fight the Yugoslav partisans because it served Italian tactical interests, even though this directly contradicted the wishes of the Croatian Ustasha regime and irritated the German command. He attended meetings in Zagreb with Croatian leader Ante Pavelić and discussed the handover of Jews to German or Croatian authorities, though the historical record shows relatively few Jews were ultimately transferred as a result of these specific discussions. On November 10, 1943, the Allied powers formally requested that Italian Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who had replaced Mussolini after the latter's arrest in July 1943, remove Rowata from his position as Chief of Staff of the Italian Army. Yugoslavia had submitted formal charges of war crimes. 2 days later, on November 12th, Rowata was dismissed from the post. On November 5, 1944, Italian authorities arrested Rowata in Rome. He was charged before the Alta Corte di Giustizia, Italy's High Court of Justice established to prosecute prominent fascists, with crimes related to his wartime conduct, including his role in the Rosselli murders and his command responsibility for the atrocities in Yugoslavia. The proceedings were part of a broader case involving 15 fascist military and political figures. In early 1945, Rowata was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was held in a military hospital in Rome due to reported health problems. On March 4, 1945, 6 weeks before Germany's surrender, Rowata escaped. The escape from a guarded military hospital in the Italian capital, 6 weeks before the end of the war in Europe, was not the act of a desperate man making an improvised break for freedom. It was organized. He made his way to Vatican City, which provided temporary sanctuary, and then traveled to Spain, where Francisco Franco, the man whose forces Rowata had helped during the Spanish Civil War, refused all extradition requests. Yugoslavia demanded his return. The requests went nowhere. The British government played a direct role in preventing Rowata's extradition. Historian Efi Pedaliu, writing in the Journal of Contemporary History in 2004, documented that British officials actively obstructed Yugoslav extradition requests for Italian war criminals, including Rowata, calculating that protecting the remnants of Italy's fascist military establishment was a worthwhile price for securing Italy as a reliable anti-communist partner in the emerging Cold War. The Western Allies had spent significant political capital trying Axis war criminals at Nuremberg and Tokyo. For Italian criminals, the calculus was different. Rowata lived in Spain for over 2 decades. He wrote his memoirs. He gave interviews. He maintained that his actions in Yugoslavia had been legitimate military operations against armed insurgents, and that the accusations against him were political distortions by communist Yugoslavia, seeking to embarrass Italy. The sentence of life imprisonment was formally overturned in Italy in 1948. When he finally returned to Italy in 1966, at the age of 79, he faced no legal consequences. He died in Rome on January 7, 1968. He was 80 years old. The contrast between the outcomes for Rowata and for the commanders on other fronts is stark. Keitel was hanged. Matsui was hanged. Homa was shot. Yamashita was hanged. Model shot himself rather than face trial. Bok-Zelewski spent his final years in prison for pre-war murders. Rowata died peacefully in his own bed, in his own country, having escaped every attempt to hold him accountable for a documented record of mass internment, systematic civilian murder, and the construction of concentration camps where people died at rates exceeding Buchenwald. The historian Rory Carroll, writing in The Guardian, described the Italian public and media as suffering from historical amnesia regarding the atrocities of the Italian military in Yugoslavia and elsewhere. Historian Alessandra Kersavan made the same argument. The amnesia was not accidental. It was the product of political decisions made immediately after the war to treat Italy as a victim of fascism rather than one of its primary perpetrators, and to protect the military figures who had served that system from the accountability that their German and Japanese counterparts faced. Quote 7, quote, "The next general on this list earned his nickname through direct personal orders that killed hundreds of civilians in reprisal massacres on a Greek island, had his victims range from Italian officers shot in mass graves to entire village populations executed for the crime of sheltering resistance fighters, and was executed by firing squad on the 6th anniversary of the Nazi invasion of Crete. One of the few occupation commanders in any theater who actually faced a firing squad for what he did. Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, the Butcher of Crete. Friedrich Wilhelm Müller was born on August 29, 1897, in Barmen, a town in the Prussian Rhine province of Western Germany. He joined the German 2nd Infantry Regiment in 1915 at the age of 17, entering the First World War as a teenage soldier. He served through the conflict, was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 266th Regiment, and emerged from the war with the foundational military experience that shaped his entire subsequent career. He stayed in the German army through the Weimar Republic years, working his way up through staff and command positions during the 1920s and 1930s. By 1936, he held the rank of major. By 1940, he was a lieutenant colonel and commander of the 105th Infantry Regiment. He was a conventional professional soldier, competent, disciplined, and completely unremarkable in the historical record until the war placed him in positions of occupation authority where the consequences of his character became visible. He received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in 1941 for operations in Russia, and oak leaves to that decoration in 1942, the German military's highest combat decorations, awarded for battlefield valor and effective command. He was, by the Wehrmacht's own standards, an excellent combat officer. Nothing in his pre-war or early war record distinguished him from hundreds of other capable German officers who fought on the Eastern Front without becoming symbols of deliberate mass murder. What changed everything was Crete. In August 1942, Müller was given command of the 22nd Air Landing Infantry Division, which was transferred from the Eastern Front to serve as the garrison force on the occupied Greek island of Crete. The island had been captured by Germany in May 1941 in Operation Mercury, a massive airborne assault that was one of the most costly operations in German military history, with the Wehrmacht suffering approximately 6,000 dead and 3,000 wounded in the battle. The Cretan population had fought alongside British and Greek forces during the invasion, with civilian men, women, and even priests picking up weapons and attacking German paratroopers. The German command never forgave the island for this. Crete in 1942 was a hostile occupation from the start. The island had an active resistance movement supported by the British Special Operations Executive, which maintained agents and supply networks across the mountainous interior. Cretan civilians sheltered British agents, guided Allied personnel to evacuation beaches, gathered intelligence, and provided food and support to resistance fighters. From the German perspective, the entire civilian population of the island was complicit in active resistance to the occupation. Müller brought to this environment a simple and murderous framework: collective punishment applied without restraint. Any act of resistance against German forces would be answered by the killing of civilians from the surrounding area in numbers designed to make further resistance too costly for the local population to sustain. The first major atrocity under his command came in September 1943, the Vianos Massacre. The trigger was an attack by Cretan resistance fighters led by Manoli Banduvas against a small German unit collecting potatoes near the village of Kato Simi on September 10, 1943. 2 German soldiers were killed. Banduvas had acted without British authorization, misled by SOE radio broadcasts into believing that Allied forces were days away from landing on Crete. No Allied landing was coming, but the attack had already happened. Müller's response was not proportional reprisal. It was the systematic destruction of an entire region. He ordered soldiers from the 65th Infantry Regiment of the 22nd Air Landing Division to destroy the Vianos district and summarily execute all males over the age of 16, as well as everyone arrested in the surrounding countryside regardless of gender or age. Troops entered the region simultaneously from multiple directions on September 13, 1943, surrounding villages before inhabitants could flee. Over September 14th, 15th, and 16th, 1943, German forces moved through approximately 20 villages in the Vianos and Ierapetra areas. Men were pulled from their homes and shot. Elderly men who could not walk were shot where they sat. Young men were shot in groups. The villages were looted and then burned. Livestock was slaughtered or driven off. Grain stores were destroyed. Wells were fouled. Everything that could sustain life in those villages through the coming winter was eliminated. The death toll from the Vianos massacre exceeded 500 civilians. Most of the 20 affected villages were left in ruins. The physical destruction of the agricultural infrastructure meant that survivors faced starvation conditions through the winter of 1943 to 1944, on top of the loss of their family members. It is worth pausing on what 500 dead means in the context of a single district of a single Greek island. Vianos was not a large area. The villages affected were small communities where everyone knew everyone else. The massacre killed a significant fraction of the adult male population of the entire district in 3 days. The women and children who survived lost their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons, their homes, their food, and their livelihoods in the same 72 hours. Müller conducted the massacre and then continued his command duties. In the autumn of 1943, following the Italian armistice with the Allies in September, Müller led German forces in operations against Italian and British forces in the Dodecanese Islands, the Greek island chain in the southeastern Aegean Sea. The Dodecanese campaign was a German victory, with Wehrmacht forces retaking islands that Italian garrisons had handed over to or were sharing with British forces following Italy's surrender. The aftermath of the campaign produced another documented atrocity. On the island of Kos, after the battle ended, Müller ordered the execution of over 100 Italian army officers who had been captured. These men were soldiers in uniform who had surrendered in a conventional military operation. Under the laws of war that had governed armed conflict for decades, they were prisoners of war entitled to the protections of the Geneva Conventions. Müller's order was that those who would not agree to fight alongside the Germans, which meant virtually all of them, were to be killed. They were shot and buried in mass graves. The execution of Italian officers on Kos was a war crime under every applicable legal standard and was documented by survivors and witnesses. It added a second major atrocity to Müller's record before he had even reached the peak of his notoriety on Crete. By 1943, British SOE officers in Cairo had concluded that Müller's conduct on the island was sufficiently damaging to the Cretan resistance and civilian population that his removal, by whatever means necessary, had become a strategic objective. Major Patrick Lee Fermor and Captain William Stanley Moss were assigned to plan and execute the abduction of Müller himself. The plan was to snatch him, remove him from the island, and bring him to Cairo as a prisoner, demonstrating to the Cretan population that the occupiers were not invulnerable. The operation was planned in detail. SOE agents landed on Crete and began the preparatory work. Then, on March 1, 1944, before the abduction could be executed, Müller was transferred from Crete and replaced by Major General Heinrich Kreipe. The SOE team, already in place and committed to the operation, redirected their efforts against Kreipe. On the night of April 26 to 27, 1944, Lee, Fermor, and Moss ambushed Kreipe's car on a road near Knossos, overpowered his driver, drove through 22 German checkpoints using Kripa's own staff car, crossed the mountains of Crete on foot with Kripa as their prisoner, and evacuated him by boat to Egypt. It was one of the most audacious SOE operations of the entire war. The man the operation had originally been designed to capture was already gone. Müller had escaped the abduction by the accident of a transfer order. On July 1, 1944, Müller returned to Crete, replacing Kripa's temporary replacement and resuming command of the island's occupation forces. He arrived with a specific agenda. The Kripa abduction had humiliated the German command and demonstrated that the local population had sheltered and assisted the SOE team during their weeks of evasion across the island. Müller was determined to punish the island for it. His return immediately intensified the reprisal campaign. The Holocaust of Kedros followed on August 22, 1944, when German forces under his orders moved through the villages of the Kedros area in the Amari Valley. 164 Greek civilians were killed. The surrounding villages were burned. Livestock was killed. Harvests were destroyed. The attacks continued. The village of Anogia was destroyed in August 1944, burned to the ground as a collective punishment for the village's support of resistance activities and its role in sheltering the Kripa abduction team. Anogia was a significant village with a documented history of resistance. Müller's order was its complete destruction. German forces burned every building and killed all men found in the area. The massacres at Damasta, Scorvula, Malathyros, and multiple villages in the Amari Valley region all occurred under Müller's command during 1943 and 1944. Each followed the same pattern: a trigger event involving resistance activity, an order from Müller directing collective punishment of the surrounding civilian population, mass executions of men, burning of villages, and destruction of the agricultural resources the population depended on for survival. By 1945, Müller had left Crete and been given command of the German Fourth Army on the Eastern Front, a force that had already been severely degraded by Soviet offensives. He commanded this formation during the Heiligenbeil pocket battles in East Prussia in early 1945, where the Fourth Army was encircled and destroyed by Soviet forces. He surrendered to the Red Army in East Prussia at the end of the war. The Soviets handed him over to Greek authorities. He was transported to Athens to stand trial before a Greek military court. The trial took place in 1946. The charges against Müller covered the massacres at Vianos, Anogia, the Amari Valley villages, Kedros, Damasta, and the execution of Italian officers on Kos. The evidence presented included survivor testimony, documentary evidence from German military records, and the testimony of witnesses who had seen the orders issued and their results. Müller's defense followed the standard pattern of German officers tried after the war. He argued that his reprisal actions were legally justified responses to partisan activity under the laws of war as he understood them, that the partisan actions that triggered the reprisals had themselves violated the laws of war by involving civilian populations, and that he had been operating within the framework of orders from higher command. The Greek military court rejected these arguments entirely. The systematic nature of the massacres, the deliberate targeting of civilians who had not participated in any resistance activity, the destruction of civilian livelihoods through the burning of villages and destruction of harvests, and the execution of surrendered Italian prisoners of war combined to produce a verdict that left no room for mitigation. On December 9, 1946, Friedrich Wilhelm Müller was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. He was held while final appeals and reviews were completed. On May 20, 1947, Friedrich Wilhelm Müller was executed by firing squad in Athens. He was 49 years old. The date chosen for the execution was deliberate. May 20th was the 6th anniversary of the German airborne invasion of Crete in 1941, the operation that had begun the German occupation of the island and set in motion everything that followed. He was executed alongside Bruno Brauer, the former commander of Fortress Crete who had also been convicted of war crimes against the Cretan population. Both men were buried at the German war cemetery of Dionysos in Greece. Smithsonian Magazine documented that Müller was a rare exception among the many German occupation commanders who had ordered civilian massacres across occupied Europe. The overwhelming majority of those commanders faced no legal consequences whatsoever. Miller faced a Greek court, a Greek verdict, and a Greek firing squad. The villages he destroyed were rebuilt over the following decades. Each one contains a war memorial to those killed during the occupation. In the village of Amiras in the Vianos area, a large memorial commemorates everyone who died during the September 1943 massacres. Every year on the anniversary, the people of those villages remember what happened. Quote 8, quote, "The last general on this list never faced any court at all. Masanobu Tsuji personally directed massacres, countermanded his own commanding officers' explicit orders to commit them, and then vanished into Asia after Japan's surrender wearing a Buddhist monk's robes, wrote a best-selling book about his wartime service, got elected to the Japanese parliament, and disappeared in Laos in 1961, with his fate never officially confirmed and his crimes never officially prosecuted. Masanobu Tsuji, the war criminal who got elected to parliament." Masanobu Tsuji was born on October 11, 1902, in Ishikawa Prefecture on the Sea of Japan coast of Honshu. His family was not military aristocracy. He came from modest origins and entered the system through ability alone, securing a place at the military academy and later graduating from the Army War College. He was physically unimpressive but intellectually exceptional, fast-thinking, intensely ideological, and possessed of a self-confidence that crossed repeatedly into arrogance. He was a devoted Pan-Asianist. He believed Japan had a divinely ordained mission to lead Asia, expel Western colonialism from the continent, and build a new order under Japanese direction. This was not unusual in the Imperial Japanese Army of the 1930s, but in Tsuji, the ideology burned at a temperature that made even his own superiors uncomfortable. He was transferred multiple times during his career because generals found him impossible to manage. Brilliant but reckless, effective but dangerous, a man whose judgment about when to stop was permanently broken. He earned a nickname inside the army, the God of Operations. It was a measure of his tactical ability. It was also, given what followed, one of the more grimly ironic titles in the history of the Second World War. By the late 1930s, he was a staff officer in the Kwantung Army in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, operating near the Soviet-Mongolian border. In March 1939, following a minor Japanese defeat at the Changkufeng incident, Tsuji personally drafted and pushed through an aggressive border policy in the name of the Kwantung Army. A policy that explicitly authorized local commanders to cross into Soviet territory, engage Soviet forces at their own discretion, and fight regardless of the location of boundaries. This policy, which directly contradicted the instructions of the Japanese government in Tokyo, triggered what became known as the Nomonhan Incident, an undeclared border war between Japan and the Soviet Union that ran through the summer of 1939. The Soviet response was commanded by Georgy Zhukov. By August 1939, Zhukov had launched a devastating counteroffensive. Japanese casualties exceeded 20,000. 700 Japanese escaped the encirclement on foot. Tsuji was among them. The disaster at Nomonhan should have ended his career. Instead, he was transferred to a quiet posting in Formosa and protected by senior officers who admired his aggression regardless of its results. The pattern of Tsuji escaping consequences for catastrophes he had caused would repeat itself throughout the war and beyond. In December 1940, during his posting in Formosa, Tsuji was tasked with setting up the Japanese Army's jungle warfare training school. He threw himself into it. He studied the terrain of Malaya in meticulous detail, personally conducted reconnaissance of the region, and developed the operational plans that would form the basis of the invasion. When the war with Britain and the United States began, he was on the staff of General Tomoyuki Yamashita as Chief of Planning and Operations for the 25th Army. The force assigned to conquer British Malaya and capture Singapore. The Malayan campaign lasted 70 days. Tsuji's planning was central to its success. He had conceived the strategy of moving infantry rapidly through jungle terrain on bicycles along paved roads, outflanking British defensive positions faster than they could be reinforced. The British command, which had confidently assessed Singapore as impregnable, never recovered from the pace of the advance. On February 15, 1942, General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore and approximately 85,000 troops. It was the largest surrender of British-commanded forces in history. 3 days later, on February 18, 1942, Operation Suk Ching began. Suk Ching is a Chinese term meaning purge through cleansing. The Japanese military term for the operation was Dai Kensho, Great Inspection. Whatever it was called, its purpose was the systematic identification and murder of ethnic Chinese in Singapore and Malaya who might be hostile to Japan. The operational planning for Suk Ching had been drawn up before Japanese troops even landed on Singapore Island. A document entitled Implementation Guideline for Manipulating Overseas Chinese had been prepared by the Military Government Section of the 25th Army, identifying the Chinese population of Singapore as a security threat. The purge was planned in advance, not improvised in the chaos of occupation. Chinese males between the ages of 18 and 50 were ordered to report to mass screening centers. Screeners, often individual soldiers or low-ranking Kempeitai military police, assessed each man for signs of anti-Japanese sentiment. Civil servants, teachers, lawyers, men with tattoos, men who had served in civilian defense units, men who could not immediately explain their occupation or background to a Japanese screener's satisfaction. All were classified as threats. Those selected were marked with a triangle stamp, separated from those marked with a square indicating release, loaded onto trucks, driven to beaches and remote areas outside the city, and killed. Documented massacre sites include the beaches at Punggol, Changi, Katong, and Tanah Merah, as well as multiple sites along the eastern coast of Singapore. Bodies were dumped into the sea or buried in mass graves. British prisoners of war were used to help bury the dead at some sites. The official Japanese figure for those killed in Singapore is 5,000. A Japanese newspaper correspondent embedded with the 25th Army testified after the war that the plan had called for the killing of 50,000 Chinese, 20% of the total, and that roughly half that number had been reached when the order came to halt the operation. Post-war Singaporean and Allied estimates of the death toll range from 25,000 to 50,000. Tsuji then extended Suk Ching to the rest of Malaya. In Malaya, the Japanese lacked the manpower and logistical capacity to conduct the systematic screening process used in Singapore. The solution was simpler. Japanese troops moved through Chinese communities across the peninsula, killing as many Chinese males as they could find, without any screening process at all. The death toll from Suk Ching across Singapore and Malaya combined is not precisely known. Estimates range from 25,000 at the low end to figures that some historians place considerably higher. In 1947, a British war crimes trial in Singapore charged 7 Japanese officers with conducting Suk Ching. All 7 were found guilty. 2. Lieutenant General Saburo Kawamura, the Singapore garrison commander, and Lieutenant Colonel Masayuki Oishi were sentenced to death and executed. 5 others received life sentences. The mastermind behind the operation, Masanobu Tsuji, was not in the dock. He had already vanished. After Singapore, Tsuji was transferred to the Philippines to serve on the staff of General Masaharu Homma, whose 14th Army had just accepted the surrender of the American and Filipino forces on Bataan. Homma had ordered that prisoners be treated fairly and that Filipinos be respected as a population under benevolent occupation. Tsuji immediately began working to subvert both instructions. He issued execution orders in Homma's name without Homma's knowledge or authorization. He ordered the execution of Philippine Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos. General Homma found out and was outraged. He had personally wanted Santos included in the new Filipino government being formed under Japanese auspices. The execution had already happened. Tsuji then directed that former Speaker of the House, Manuel Roxas, be executed. Homma found out, countermanded the order, and stopped the killing. Roxas survived and later became the first president of the Independent Republic of the Philippines. Most critically for the historical record, Tsuji personally organized and directed the Pantingan River Massacre during the Bataan Death March. Approximately 350 to 400 Filipino officers and non-commissioned officers who had formally surrendered were marched to the Pentingin River under his supervision, bound, and executed. These were surrendered soldiers entitled under every applicable rule of war to prisoner of war status. Tzu killed them anyway. He also pushed actively through the existing command structure for all American prisoners to be killed during the march, encouraging the systematic brutality that characterized the Japanese guards' treatment of the column. Hama countermanded many of Tsuji's execution orders when he discovered them. He was executed after the war for the consequences of his subordinates' conduct during the Bataan Death March. Tsuji, who had personally directed the specific atrocities for which Hama was held responsible, was running free in Asia. From the Philippines, Tsuji moved to Guadalcanal in late 1942, where he planned and personally led the last major Japanese ground assaults against American forces on the island in October 1942. His planning was wrong. The attacks were repulsed with heavy Japanese casualties. An assault force of approximately 5,000 men was decimated. Tsuji then traveled personally to Tokyo to argue, somewhat contradictorily, for the evacuation of remaining Japanese forces, which eventually happened. The Guadalcanal fiasco discredited him, and he was sent to the largely inactive headquarters in Nanjing, China. In mid-1944, he was sent to Burma, where Japanese forces had been badly defeated at Imphal. It was in Burma that the documented cannibalism occurred. While serving with the 33rd Army in northeastern Burma, Tsuji consumed the raw liver of a captured Allied airman, identified in various sources as British or American. His stated justification, reported by multiple sources, was, "The more we consume, the more we shall be infused with a hostile spirit toward the enemy." This was not desperation eating during a supply shortage. It was deliberate and ideological. American military police investigators, following the Japanese surrender in Burma, specifically sought Tsuji for questioning about this incident and about the murder of the airman. He had already fled. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Tsuji was in Thailand. He disguised himself as a Buddhist monk, shaved his head, dressed in robes, and moved through Southeast Asia, avoiding Allied capture. He traveled through China, where he worked with nationalist Chinese forces fighting the communists for several years, using contacts he had built during his time in Nanjing. The American military authorities who occupied Japan were aware of him. A CIA document from 1954, declassified decades later, described him as the type of man who, given the chance, would start World War III without any misgivings. The same document noted ongoing monitoring of his activities in connection with Japanese rearmament discussions. He returned to Japan secretly in May 1948, protected initially by American military intelligence, specifically G2 of General Headquarters, who found his knowledge of Asian communist movements operationally useful during the early Cold War. He was allowed to resign from his covert service with Chinese nationalist forces and returned openly to Japanese society. In 1950, he published his memoir of the Malayan Campaign under the title Japan's Greatest Victory, Britain's Worst Defeat. The book was a bestseller. It made him famous. He accepted its royalties and gave interviews. In 1952, he was elected to the Japanese Diet, the national parliament, as a conservative politician. He was re-elected in 1955 and again in 1958. During his 3 terms in parliament, he was an outspoken advocate of renewed Japanese militarism and an opponent of the post-war pacifist constitution. He was celebrated in certain political circles as a war hero. The 7 men who had followed his commands during Sukching, 2 of whom were executed, 5 of whom received life sentences, had served their punishment while the man who planned the operation sat in the Japanese parliament collecting a salary. In April 1961, Tsuji traveled to Laos on what was described as a private trip. Laos was in the middle of a civil war between the Royal Lao government and Communist Pathet Lao forces. He was never seen or heard from again. His wife Chitos was subsequently interviewed by author John Toland for his History of the Pacific War. No confirmed account of his death or remains was ever produced. The Japanese government officially declared him dead on July 20, 1968. 7 years after his disappearance. What killed him in Laos, if that is where he died, is unknown. The theories are numerous. Some sources believe he was captured and killed by communist guerrillas near the Plain of Jars. A declassified CIA report suggested he may have actually joined communist forces there, pursuing his Pan-Asian ideology to its conclusion by aligning with the movement he had spent years working against. One account places him boarding a Soviet aircraft at Vientiane Airport bound for Hanoi. None of these accounts have been confirmed. The man who had escaped accountability for a decade and a half after the war ended by dying somewhere in Southeast Asia in circumstances that were never established. Fittingly, given everything that preceded it, left no confirmed record of his final ending either. The 2 men executed for Sukching followed his commands. Masaharu Homa was shot for the Bataan Death March atrocities that Tsuji personally directed. Tomoyuki Yamashita was hanged for the Manila Massacre and broader Philippine atrocities, some of which involved the Kempeitai command structures that Tsuji had helped poison with his no prisoners philosophy. The men who faced firing squads and gallows for the crimes of the Pacific War included many who bore far less personal responsibility for specific murders than the colonel who wrote best-selling books and got elected to parliament. That is the final accounting of this list of 10. 9 of the 10 men documented here, Tojo, Matsui, Keitel, Yamashita, Homa, Mueller, and the others, faced courts, verdicts, and in most cases, execution. Bak Zalewski died in prison for pre-war murders. Rowata died in his own bed after decades of protected exile. Tsuji died somewhere in Laos with his crimes formally unexamined by any court that had authority to reach him. The history of the Second World War is in part the history of what those courts achieved. It is also, unavoidably, the history of what they did not. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.